All right, let's just jump right in. We are all super familiar with the trope of the flashy, charismatic CEO, right? You know the type. The visionary genius who steps up, single-handedly commands the stage, rescues the entire company, and basically dictates the future from the top down. We absolutely idolize this image in modern business. But what if we've got it all wrong? Is it possible that this heroic, front-stage style of leadership is actually the completely wrong way to look at true business success? Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to completely shatter that myth of the visionary leader. We're going to pull back the curtain and reveal what actually keeps a company alive, adapting, and thriving in the real world. We're talking about the hidden backstage mechanics of organizational strategy. Because as it turns out, the real magic, it doesn't happen under the bright spotlight. It happens in the messy, invisible plumbing of the organization. So let's kick things off with Section 1, the heroic leader myth. Now look, we all love a good heroic tale, especially when a visionary maverick enters a boring, dusty industry and just shakes everything up with creative zeal. But what happens when an entire corporate strategy relies solely on that front stage vision? Well, you end up with a number like this, 13 billion euros. That's a staggering amount of money to lose. But it's exactly what happened during the spectacular failure of Vivendi under Jean-Marie Messier back in the early 2000s. See, Messier was this flamboyant, widely celebrated leader. He aggressively transformed a boring French waterworks company into this glitzy global media empire. And I mean, the press absolutely loved him for it. But the strategy itself, it was a total bust. Why? Because he completely ignored the backstage plumbing. He was buying up companies left and right, but he built literally zero internal processes to integrate them or to make sense of the changing market. The front stage was dazzling, for sure, but the backstage was just non-existent. And honestly, that Vivendi story brilliantly highlights the core difference we need to wrap our heads around today. Front stage leadership is all the visible stuff. It's the charisma, the big public speeches, the clever PR, the grand, sweeping visions. Backstage leadership, on the other hand, is the messy, vital reality. It's the plumbing, the company culture, the ongoing, grinding processes of strategy development. Because here's the secret. Strategies are almost never born perfectly formed from a single genius epiphany. They require testing, swapping, and building networks of real capability over a long period of time. To see what happens when you ignore that, just look at the British insurance company, Norwich Union. Their CEO, Patrick Snowball, confidently stood on a conference stage one day and commanded a brand new strategy from on high. Insurance at our core, care at our hearts. Sounds nice, right? He fully expected cheers. Instead, he was met with dead, cynical silence. Finally, one exhausted manager spoke up and said, "But we don't understand where this has come from." Snowball's top-down directive completely failed to read the exhausted emotional pulse of his own managers, who had literally just survived rounds of brutal cost-cutting. It was a purely front-stage move with absolutely zero backstage engagement. Which brings us to Section 2. What is backstage leadership? Let's get into the vital mechanics. So if shouting top-down commands from a stage doesn't work, what actually does? How does backstage leadership fuel a company's dynamic ability to adapt and win? A classic example of this is Honda's entry into the US motorcycle market. Now the myth, what business schools often call the Honda A story, says Honda executed this flawless top-down master plan to sell small 50cc bikes based on brilliant economic deduction. But the messy reality, the Honda B story, it shows they actually tried to sell big, heavy bikes first, and they failed miserably. They only succeeded because their staff on the ground in the US were riding the little 50cc bikes around town to run errands. People noticed them, thought they were cool, and wanted to buy them. The managers on the ground saw this and adapted the strategy from the bottom up. True strategy is messy. It's highly adaptive. But how do you actually systematize that kind of messy adaptation? Well, take a look at Pixar's famous brain trust. Ed Catmull didn't just walk into Pixar and command his team to be innovative. Instead, he spent years seeding a backstage culture that would naturally foster it. He set up these brain trust meetings where directors would show their rough works in progress to their peers. But the real genius here was meticulously removing power dynamics from the room. It took a long time to perfect, but doing that allowed for brutal, constructive honesty and truly collaborative strategy, all without ever robbing the actual director of their creative control. To really make these backstage processes work, though, you need what management thinker Richard Rumelt calls the kernel of good strategy. I like to think of it almost like a glowing sci-fi energy core that powers a starship. It's broken down into 3 essential steps. First, you need a clear diagnosis of the actual challenge. Second, a guiding policy to overcome that specific challenge. And third, coherent actions that are fully coordinated to carry out that policy. You see, a good strategy isn't just some fluffy, aspirational goal. It's a really deep read of your context translated into aligned practical action. And getting that deep read leads us perfectly into Section 3, the art of sense-making. So, how exactly do we achieve that deep read of our environment? Through sense-making. Sense-making is this absolutely vital backstage skill where leaders actively track environmental changes, actively discard their own confirmation biases, and piece together entirely new strategies. And the very first step of sense-making is scanning. Think of it like a spider detecting tiny vibrations on its web. An organization needs to cast a really wide net to capture weak signals in the market before anyone else does. This means you've got to track science labs, keep a super close eye on your most extreme customers, watch your competitors, and even study analogous organizations that are completely outside of your industry. You have to build daily routines that force your company to absorb these outside signals. And honestly, this is exactly how brilliant disruptions are born. Let's talk about IKEA. Back in post-war Sweden, Ingvar Kamprad used brilliant sense-making. He was watching the market and noticed that established furniture retailers were adding massive markups and restricting their inventory based purely on physical showroom space. He looked at those signals and connected the dots. He realized that if he bypassed traditional retailers by using mail-order catalogs and later introduced flat-pack designs where customers assemble the furniture themselves, he could offer a revolutionary combination of low cost and high convenience. He didn't just guess, he saw a signal and he made sense of it. This exact sense-making approach is how the best modern tech giants operate today. Just listen to this quote from Patty McCord, who co-created Netflix's famous culture deck. She said, "The more you see yourself as a teacher rather than a teller or permission giver, the more effective your team will be." Netflix realized super early on that linear TV, waiting a whole week for one new episode, was highly inefficient. But the leadership didn't just issue a top-down order to fix it. By choosing to provide context over control, literally teaching their employees the competitive landscape rather than giving them strict orders, Netflix empowered its entire team to spot that inefficiency and invent the modern concept of binge watching. All right, moving on to Section 4, defeating dangerous business dogma, because every good story needs a villain. And dogma is absolutely the ultimate enemy of sense-making. It's what happens when your organization becomes so deeply convinced of its own legacy rules that it literally goes blind. Now, the most dangerous mechanism of dogma is something sociologists call normalization. A tragic non-business example of this is the 1986 Challenger space shuttle disaster. There was actually existing evidence that the O-ring seals were eroding in cold temperatures on previous flights. But because those previous flights didn't explode, that severe risk was normalized by the team. It just blended into the background as just the way things are. Normalization stops us from seeing critical, glaring anomalies before they destroy us. Bringing it back to the business world, let's contrast Polaroid's dogma with their reality. A lot of people don't know this, but Polaroid actually had an incredible technological lead in early digital imaging. They were way ahead, but their executives were dogmatically obsessed with the razor and blade business model. They firmly believed that money could only be made by selling physical instant film, period. They simply couldn't conceptualize a reality where consumers would want digital sharing instead of physical prints. Their dogma literally blinded them to a massive market that they could have easily dominated. For an even larger, more catastrophic example, look at the 2008 financial crisis. The entire global housing market was propped up on this incredibly dangerous dogma, the belief that property values always rise and that mortgage-backed securities are completely infallible. Because basically everyone in finance accepted this dogma without question, massive, glaring anomalies, like people with no income holding multiple homes on exploding interest-only loans, were just completely normalized by the industry. It was business as usual. But a very small group of people actually fought that dogma, and their story perfectly highlights the sheer power of backstage sense-making. Guys like Michael Burry and Steve Eisman saw the 2008 crash coming from a mile away. How did they do it? By doing the dirty, unglamorous backstage work. Burry literally made it his job to disagree loudly with popular sentiment. He sat down and did the tedious, mind-numbing work of actually reading through thousands of individual mortgage bonds to find the hidden rot, while everyone else on Wall Street was just blindly trusting the AAA ratings. And Steve Eisman had a brilliantly simple tactic for fighting this dogma too. He called it staying in the question. Eisman would constantly ask Wall Street bankers to explain their complex financial products to him simply. He'd ask them over and over again, sometimes 30 times. He wasn't trying to confirm his bias. He was actively trying to disconfirm his own beliefs. By staying in this persistent, questioning state of mind, rather than just reaching for easy certainty, he realized a terrifying truth. The bankers had absolutely no idea what they were actually selling. So, as we wrap up this explainer, the crucial takeaway here boils down to a question you really need to ask yourself. Are you leading entirely from the front stage? Are you just relying on big speeches, charisma, and grand visions? Or are you doing the real, messy, invisible work of building the backstage? Because true strategy isn't about being a flawless visionary standing on a pedestal. It's about being a corporate plumber. It's about setting up the gritty processes to scan the horizon, make sense of all the noise, defeat your own internal dogma, and actually let the right ideas bubble up from the ground. Because sure, the stage might be where the applause happens, but the backstage, that's where the performance is actually made.